Well, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. I'll explain to you this replica of this little church here. This replica of this church was built by Pastor Ralph Crawford. He's 93 years old. He was the pastor of this church for 25 and a half years. Of course, he's been retired for a while. His wife died a few weeks ago. But I gave him a picture of this little church and said, "Can you make a replica of this?" You know, he said, "Oh," he says, "that is such a beautiful little building." He said, "Yeah, I can do that." Well, the reason why I wanted him to build it is because this church is the Hamlin Baptist Church in Hamlin, Kansas. Hamlin, Kansas was established in 1870. And my great-grandfather, Frank Kern, moved there in 1883. My grandfather was born in that area and was raised in this church right here, that church. And my dad was also raised in that church in Hamlin, Kansas. And when he graduated from high school, there were only 40 kids in the whole school that he graduated from. But I heard that that church, I've attended in that church when I was a kid in the 50s, went to a wedding there in Hamlin, Kansas. And it was a special place for me. I got word here a couple of years ago that they tore it down. But I got to thinking about that and how that church is such a big part of me and who I am. Because I think about my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and then my dad. Each one of them becoming born-again Christians who lived their life with Christ. Amen. I can remember my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Frank Kern. He was one of the original bus ministry kind of guys. He, even though he's a farmer, he bought one of the biggest cars you could get back there in the 10s and the 20s, so he could bring more kids to church on Sunday. Praise and so anyway, then my grandfather was a deacon in that church, and that's the church where my dad became a Christian. And I think about it, if he hadn't become a Christian and he raised me in church in order to know Jesus, I don't know who I'd be or where I'd be now. And so it's a very special thing to me. But the thing about it is, it's become a part of who I am. But even bigger than that, if you'll remember, back in the early 1900s, the 1800s, and even in during the Revolutionary War, there were little churches like this all over this country. And most of the people lived in rural areas, and they went to these churches. And that's where the Christianity of this nation flourished. I want to read this to you from Alex de Tocqueville.
Explain who he was.
Alex de Tocqueville was a historian from France. And he wanted to write a story or a book about the difference between the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. Why they were so different, why the U.S. succeeded so, and the French Revolution was such a disaster. And so he came, and he went all across this country just looking for what's the real secret to the success of America. And he said this, he wrote this: "I sought for the key to the greatness and genius of America and her harbors, in her fertile fields and boundless forests, in her rich mines, vast world commerce, in her public school system, institutions of learning. I sought for it in her democratic Congress and in her matchless Constitution. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits flame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius power. America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. And that's our legacy. And I wrote this song with a burden because it seems to me like we're losing that legacy of goodness. And as we lose that legacy of goodness, we're also losing our greatness.
Let me just say a word. This song is inspired. You can understand it is and understand why. Listen carefully. God inspired it, and God will bless you as you hear it.
There's a little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas. That little old church still stands inside of me. For that little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas was where my daddy out to Calvary. And that little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas still stands all my memories. For that little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas is the root of who I've come to be. For she stands for my Christianity, and she stands for my nation's liberty. That little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas is a symbol of my legacy. Well, that little old church stood in Hamlin, Kansas. They tore down just recently. And that little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas is being lost in our history. But she stands for our Christianity, and she stands for our nation's liberty. That little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas is a symbol of our legacy. Well, that little old church that stood in Hamlin, Kansas, that little old church still stands inside of me.